On a Tuesday afternoon in March 2024, behind closed doors in a nondescript federal building in Washington, D.C., Treasury officials sat reviewing projections that would never appear in any press release. Outside, traffic moved normally along Constitution Avenue. People complained about gas prices, checked their phones, went about their lives. But inside that room, there was a tension that comes from watching something inevitable approach with no clear way to stop it. The unseen problem at the center of their discussion was not just large, it was existential. America's national debt had crossed $34 trillion, and the trajectory was accelerating. Every second, another $75,000 was being added, not from emergency spending, but from the basic arithmetic of how the system now functioned. And they were waiting for the moment when the mathematics of debt would force decisions no elected official wanted to make. The widely accepted narrative goes like this. Yes, the number is large, but it is manageable because the US dollar is the world's reserve currency and we have had debt before without catastrophic consequences. Most people believe debt is just something governments carry, like a mortgage. Headlines reassure us that economic growth will eventually outpace borrowing. The official narrative from both parties has been consistent. This needs addressing eventually, but not immediately. After World War II, debt exceeded 100% of GDP, and America grew out of it. This perspective is not entirely wrong. The dollar's reserve status does provide advantages other nations do not have, but the reality was different from what most coverage suggested. The mechanisms that had made America's debt sustainable were quietly breaking down, and this overlooked detail changed everything. 3 fundamental shifts had occurred simultaneously, creating a situation with no modern precedent. First, demographics had inverted. The working-age population now grew slower than the retired population. More baby boomers were claiming Social Security and Medicare, benefits promised by law. The trust funds were already spent, replaced with Treasury I.O., use that needed redemption with actual tax dollars. Second, the global financial architecture supporting dollar dominance was fracturing. Countries were settling trade in alternative currencies. Central bank reserves held in dollars had dropped from 70% in 2000 to below 60% by 2024. Automatic. Demand for U.S. debt was weakening precisely when supply was exploding. Third, interest rates had fundamentally changed. For 40 years, rates had declined, meaning even as debt grew, servicing costs stayed manageable. That dynamic reversed. Every percentage point increase added hundreds of billions to annual interest costs. The math was straightforward and brutal. This was not about one bad decision. This was a chain reaction built into how modern government finance worked. The system depended on continuous borrowing as its basic operating assumption. Discretionary spending was only 30% of the budget. The rest was mandatory spending plus interest payments that could not be negotiated. There was no single switch to flip, no obvious ways to cut. The Congressional Budget Office projected debt would reach 180% of GDP by 2050. Assuming no wars, recessions, or history suggested that was unrealistic. The stakes were irreversible. When markets doubt debt sustainability, consequences cascade through the entire economy. Interest rates rise, affecting mortgages and business investments. The currency weakens. Government services get cut, not by choice, but by mathematical necessity. If you are finding this valuable so far, hit subscribe. We break down what the mainstream will not cover every single week. Any realistic solution required significant tax increases, major entitlement cuts, or both. Neither party had appetite for this. The constraint was fundamental. Seniors voted at higher rates and were primary beneficiaries of programs needing reform. Any politician proposing actual cuts to Social Security or Medicare faced electoral defeat. Tax increases faced their own wall. During 2024, not a single major candidate proposed serious entitlement reform or broad-based tax increases. The math did not work, but political incentives were clear. There was no precedent for democratic systems accepting preventive sacrifice. As debt grew, markets demanded higher interest rates. More debt meant more risk. But higher rates made servicing existing debt more expensive, requiring more borrowing, pushing rates higher still. This feedback loop had a tipping point somewhere around 150 to 2. 100% of GDP. America was past 120% and accelerating. The constraint was that once markets lost confidence, every historical example involved painful adjustment measured in years or decades. Greece's economy shrank 25%. Argentina defaulted repeatedly. Japan stagnated for decades. Behind the scenes, the Federal Reserve was the invisible pressure point, controlling what options remained. The Fed, too, mandates price stability and maximum employment, increasingly conflicted. Raising rates to fight inflation made debt more expensive. Keeping rates low risked entrenched inflation. This infrastructure few understood could not simply print money indefinitely. The Fed credibility was itself an asset that could be depleted. The metaphor was a suspension bridge. Debt was the weight. Market confidence was the cables. Engineers had been adding weight without reinforcing cables, assuming they would hold because they always had. But cables have load limits, invisible until they begin to fail. And bridges do not gradually sag. They hold until they do not. By March 2024, several lines had been crossed. Interest payments exceeded defense spending. The Congressional Budget Office had revised projections upward for 3 consecutive years. Primary dealers had started failing to meet obligations at Treasury auctions. These were the cracks. The line crossed was when the trajectory became unsustainable under any realistic scenario. No margin for error remained. This was the turning point when the problem shifted from future generations to forcing action within the current decade. When the decision point arrived, policymakers would face options all involving significant pain. They chose not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Option 1 was austerity, deep spending cuts, and broad tax increases. This guaranteed severe recession, possibly depression, and likely social unrest. Option 2 was inflation, letting the Fed monetize debt by printing money. This would destroy savings, hammer retirees, and likely end the dollar reserve status. Option 3 was default, restructuring obligations to bond. This would trigger global financial crises and lock America out of capital markets. The choice would ultimately be some combination of all three, implemented gradually. But pain was coming because mathematics allowed no other possibility. The long-term impact would fundamentally alter what it meant to be American. Ordinary people would bear the burden most directly. Government services would shrink. Benefits paid into 4 decades would be reduced. The social mobility defining the American dream would slow as investment in education and infrastructure fell. Military dominance would erode as defense spending was sacrificed to pay interest. The downstream effects would touch every aspect of American life and persist for generations. The international order built on American economic strength would evolve based on diminished capacity. The deeper pattern revealed an uncomfortable truth. The system had been designed to produce exactly this outcome. The structural reality was that democracies struggled to make preventive sacrifices. Elected officials faced short election cycles. They won by promising benefits and opposing costs. Voters rewarded immediate gains and punished immediate pain. This was not corruption. It was rational behavior responding to incentives. Debt was the path of least resistance, delivering spending without imposing taxes to pay for it. There was a quote from one analyst in that March meeting. "We keep pretending that tomorrow's budget will somehow be different from today, that future politicians will make the hard choices we are unwilling to make. But the future is just more people facing the same incentives we face. The math does not care about our intentions." Every generation of leaders had recognized the trajectory was unsustainable. Commissions formed, reports written, warnings issued. Then nothing changed, because changing it required accepting political defeat for uncertain long-term benefits. The rational choice for each politician was leaving the problem to their successor, and so they did, until the problem became too large to ignore and too entrenched to solve without severe pain. The room in Washington was not where the crisis began, and it will not be where it ends. It was simply the moment when people whose job was understanding the numbers could no longer pretend they would work themselves out. The waiting was over. The decisions were coming, and America would never quite be the same country on the other side of them. If this changed how you see America's real economic situation, do 3 things. Subscribe for investigations the news will not touch. Drop your biggest concern in the comments below. And watch the next video where I reveal what happens when the dollar loses reserve currency status and how it hits your wallet. See you there.